What is going on, everyone? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the new sci-fi horror movie Underwater starring Kristen Stewart. The movie's the work of director William Eubank, a director I've never been exposed to before, but the story is all about what happens to a crew drilling in the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean, when they drill a little too greedily and awaken something that nearly destroys their entire rig and begins picking them off one at a time. The drilling area is basically this giant underwater network of interconnected bases and labs, all of which are damaged, but some may or may not contain escape pods that'll help the characters get back to the surface. I won't discuss any spoilers until the very end of the review, and I'll give you fair warning when I do. In any event, the movie's totally fine, but not really good enough or bad enough to give me a lot of fuel for an impassioned discussion of the movie. If you're a diehard horror and science fiction fan, by all means, have a look for yourself. But I can't really make a strong case for people throwing down their hard-earned money and making a trip to the theater to see it. We're in what's typically the driest part of the year for new releases, where Hollywood seems to kind of slow down and catch its breath before gearing up for the summer movie season, a phenomenon that seems to start a little earlier with each passing year. But typically this time of year, it's hard to find a lot of really good excuses to get excited to even go to the theater. But with that in mind, I'm a horror and science fiction junkie, and I love and adore Kristen Stewart. Ever since I first saw her in David Fincher's movie Panic Room back in 2002, we've been basically watching Kristen Stewart grow up on the big screen from child actor to now leading lady. And I like how she bounces back and forth between giant franchises like Twilight and then serious art house fare like Clouds of Sils Maria and Personal Shopper. I'm always impressed when an actor or actress can find that balance and make such a sincere effort to work on all kinds of movies. Her Twilight co-star Robert Pattinson has also embraced a similar filmmaking philosophy with great results as well. So let me just say from the outset that the feature attraction of this movie is Kristen Stewart. While the ensemble cast is pretty good all around and includes performers like Vincent Cassel as the captain and TJ Miller for comic relief, that said, Kristen Stewart easily has the meatiest role, the best heroic moments, and certainly the most interesting imagery in the movie. The influence of Ridley Scott and James Cameron is all over this movie, but the biggest influence of all seems to be the final scene from Alien, where Ripley, in her underwear, finally defeats the creature that killed her crew. Recognizing that sci-fi and beautiful women go together like chocolate and peanut butter, this movie seems to have been tailor-made to show off all the work that Kristen Stewart has been doing recently in the gym. She looks incredible and has packed on enough muscle to be a convincing badass mechanical engineer. But when the movie isn't taking one of its frequent breaks to ogle at the lead, we're left with a series of relatively engaging but unremarkable action scenes where the crew tries to make its way across the ocean floor to try to get to the pods that might get them home. The suits they all wear look really cool, but I'd argue that the action scenes and the encounters with the creatures hinted at in the trailer are conventional at best. There are plenty of jump scares and situations where characters are like running out of air or trying to avoid dying to explosive decompression, but for most of the movie there's nothing really all that groundbreaking at play that we haven't seen many times before. If a movie like James Cameron's The Abyss or an old school classic like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea are the high watermark for this genre, Underwater is probably a few notches below, close to but not all the way down, next to the 1989 horror flick Leviathan, a movie that terrified me as a kid, but has probably not been seen by anybody in many years. So as I mentioned before, you can totally feel a deep love of the films of James Cameron and Ridley Scott in this film, but this is not to say that Underwater is anywhere near that level of artistry and craftsmanship. The movie's totally fine and occasionally pretty enjoyable, but so much of it feels forgettable, in particular the first half, where the crew races from one crisis to the next, trying to stay one step ahead of the crumbling infrastructure of their headquarters. This is just one of those cases where the screenplay is totally adequate, but is sadly unexceptional. TJ Miller's jokes start to feel really repetitive, and the words of encouragement between the crew members to keep going all start to feel very routine. What I think is going to make or break the movie for people is the monsters and their design. On the whole, I have to admit, I was pretty unimpressed with their look, but the movie offers a pretty plausible theory as to where they came from and how they survived this long in isolation. Now, I have to discuss one major plot twist, and it's totally a spoiler, so if you want to go into this movie completely clean, bail out now. Although, this one little detail might be the thing that gets you to go to the movie in the first place. But last warning, 3, 2, 1. So anytime you're dealing with slimy underwater creatures and horror, naturally some people are going to start thinking about the fiction of author H.P. Lovecraft. Now, I've read a ton of his stuff. I'm a massive fan. And I even did a podcast recently all about the movie, television, and video game adaptations of his work. I'll include a link in the show notes below if you want to listen to it. But about 2/3 of the way through this movie, there's a very brief shot of a very recognizable drawing for anyone who has read The Call of Cthulhu. From what we see with all the maps in this lab, it appears as if the drilling of this crew was geared very specifically toward a designated spot, which ends up unleashing the source of all these monsters, this giant, enormous entity that looks very similar to classic renditions of Cthulhu. While the movie initially offers up a scientific explanation for organisms that live off heat escaping from deep within the planet, later we see that all these monsters are basically an extension or like little parasites for this godlike monstrosity, one that's capable of tearing apart the largest man-made buildings like aluminum foil. So I did get a huge geeky thrill from this revelation, and I liked a lot of those shots, but it wasn't enough for me to tell every horror fan out there that they need to race out and see this movie. But if you're a Lovecraft completionist and you like to see any movie that tips its hat to his work, I do think you'll get a kick out of those scenes. But I think that's all I have to say about this. I know this is a really brief, short review, but there's just not that much about underwater to discuss. Something tells me that this time next year, very few people will remember that the movie even came out at all. So I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. But if you enjoyed this review, please consider giving the video a like, subscribing to the channel. That's super helpful to the channel overall. And I'm always down to talk about Lovecraft or horror movies or Kristen Stewart or whatever on Twitter at Colbrex. So leave me a comment in the comments below. But coming up in the near future, I'm definitely going to be tackling The Outsider on HBO on Sunday, and I'm going to be tackling The New Pope on HBO on Monday. So those shows hopefully will give me a lot of cool stuff to talk about on this channel in the near future. But can't thank you enough for watching the video. I really appreciate it. Hope everyone has an amazing weekend, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.